Men in infantry had tried to mark and point and pull the tanks forward. But in the wet jungle, the markers would sink, and the shouts would vanish against engines and gunfire. Officers spoke in maps and terms, ranges, fields of fire, the weight of ordnance. Soldiers spoke in pounds of flesh, and in the way the jungle fog smeared the muzzle flash. Lieutenant William Harrison, an armor officer who respected forms and feared improvisation because it brought unpredictable costs, argued that tanks must advance with supported infantry, that doctrine existed for survival. Sergeant Carl Rodriguez, practical and blunt, worried about men he had eaten with, brothers in mess kits whose faces he could still name. Between those voices, Jesse found space to think, and a small stubborn conviction took shape. If the tanks could not see, someone could. It was the sort of idea that read like madness on a paper and like logic in a man's hands. To climb onto a hull, to ride where splash and flame and shrapnel could catch him. No officer wanted a private to do that. Yet in storm and heat, the tactics that did not live in manuals sometimes kept men alive. Jesse tested the notion against his own fear, and against the memory of his brother. He pictured Robert's last photograph, a grin at the camera with two big shoulders. He thought of the telegram folded in his pocket, and the fact that no metal could bring the boy back. That calculus, private and cold, turned into resolve. The attack began in the gray where sleep and wake collided. The tanks moved forward in a line that looked as if a herd of iron had decided it might be modestly kind. The first flamethrowers spat, and the napalm shed light on leaf and rock. It glowed orange and obscene, and in its light the bunkers did not always look like bunkers. Men crouched low. The noise was a living thing. Engines, the rattle of small arms, the sharp clatter of tracer round against wood. Smoke pooled like a dishonored cloth. Jesse climbed. The sound of his boots on steel was a little louder than a promise. He took a place near a projection where the tank commander could nod and the flamethrower operator could see the impulse. From the deck, the world made different demands. The wind found new angles. The heat that came back at him was its own element. He had his rifle slung, but his hands were chiefly tools for balance and for pointing. The move was simple in intention and vast in consequence. He was not standing to be brave for its own sake. He was standing because someone needed to see. He found targets the tanks could not. He pointed, not with frantic arms, but with steady fingers learned from years of cutting lines in rough weather. Left, he called over the roar, each syllable a chip of sound in a river of noise. The tank turned what visibility it had, and burned where he indicated. When a bunker belched flame the first time, and men tried to crawl away, he was there, shouting directions, watching where the shadows moved. They would argue in formal lines about whether his climb was reckless or prescient, and an officer with a ledger would write the words "extraordinary heroism" beside his name. But at the time, it was only a sequence of acts. He pointed, they burned where he said, men crawled out, and he did not let the flames make a tomb. In the chaotic accounting of battle, long before the medal, a line of men lived because Jesse had decided to stand where the tank could not see.
After the smoke settled enough to clear a path, the hornet's nest did not look like an army victory on a postcard. It looked like a landscape reorganized by fire. The pillboxes were empty or ruined. Bodies lay where men had once used shadow as shelter. The 754th's tanks had paid a price, but the position that had blunted weeks of effort broke. Down in the valley, survivors counted what they could and named the hollow spaces left by those who would not come home to Michigan or anywhere else. Jesse did not go to headquarters to reenact the moment. He walked like a man who had been doing mathematics and found his answers messy. He had blood under his nails from helping, tiny burns on the backs of his hands, a grit in his teeth that would not wash with rain. He sat later on a crate and unfolded the telegram in private, tracing the crease of his brother's name with a finger that learned to keep grief contained. For him, the medal was not yet a thing. There was only the immediate gravity of survival and the moral arithmetic that lingered. How many men would be less likely to die because a private had chosen to die a little of himself? Word moved as it would. A tank commander would mention the spotter, then a sergeant, then the lieutenant, and eventually the paper route of recommendations reached someone with power to write the right phrase on the right form. The Army bureaucracy took the event and translated it into a citation. The words "risked his life" appeared with proper cadence. Yet the transformation from field improvisation to recognized doctrine is never only a matter of brave sentences. It is a slow, stubborn plumbing of logic into manuals. After Buna, discussions began not only about praising a man, but about replication. How to equip flame tanks with better viewports, how to train infantrymen as designated spotters, how to write down what men in the line had known by instinct. Back in Michigan after the war, Jesse returned to a life that fit him like a work shirt. He married. He worked with his hands. He went to the Medal of Honor ceremony when the Army summoned him, sat stiff as the photographs, and accepted a ribbon that fit strangely against his chest. He never said at length that the medal made anything right. It acknowledged a moment, but not the brother he would never see again, nor the men who carried their scars in ways a medal could not remedy.
The medal hung in a small case in a house that smelled of sawdust and coffee. Children learned to point at it and ask about the man who had been on a hill where morning broke with gunfire. Institutional change crept slower than any single citation. Manuals were revised in cautious paragraphs, and a doctrine that had once refused a private space for improvisation began, ironically, to codify the very improvisation that saved lives. Training centers adopted procedures, designate a deck spotter, practice hand signals under noise, improve fuel containment and escape routes for crews. Tanks were modified, not to make men climb on the hull, but to make the tanks less blind. In Army offices, men in shirts without calluses argued in terms that meant little to Jesse. In the barracks and in the field, men with the same hands adapted quickly, learning a practice that was less about heroics and more about mutual survival. The public remembers icons and parades. Memory tends to prefer a face and a tidy narrative. Jesse's face was not absent from the history books, but it was not the headline men either. He remained an unsung kind of hero, spoken of in letters and in the careful notes between officers who had seen the hull of a tank open and men crawl out. Families kept his story. Veterans told it over beer and plywood tables.
and the practical men of the service rewrote parts of their craft around the simple arithmetic: visibility saves lives. There was in that arithmetic a bitter root. Jesse had not climbed because he sought adulation. He climbed because the world contained his brother's name in a folded piece of paper. The medal could not resurrect Robert J. Drowy. It could not erase the nights when Jesse woke hearing the hiss of flames. It could not give back a boy's laugh. The award acknowledged a deed, but could not settle the private ledger between a man and his grief. That tension, state honor against private ruin, settled into his life like a quiet ache. Years later, children would stand in museums and see a flame tank under a placard that told the approved version. A soldier's steady hand, a tactical innovation, doctrine improved. They would read the names and assume the world resolves itself neatly into metal and memory. Behind the glass, the flame was inert, its power reduced to a long polymer plaque and a curator's voice. Yet the real change was in training fields and in the way squads learned to point and watch. The victory attributed to better tanks and smarter commands had very human causes. Small, stubborn acts taken on a morning when the sun had not yet decided which side to warm. When historians later argued about the scale of the Buna action, they used phrases like turning point and operational advantage. The Hornets' Nest collapse opened a flanking line. It saved dozens who might otherwise have been burned or pinned. Men who would have been counted among the casualties walked away.
An army revised a paragraph in its manual, and in doing so saved more lives in later engagements. The move that some might scoff at as a private's rashness became, in the ledger of consequences, one of the key human inputs to a large-scale gain. People sometimes asked if he felt proud. For Jesse, pride was a private, almost embarrassed thing, like stopping to tie a boot before returning to a job. There were nights when he held his child and felt the world be precise in its softness. There were other nights when the pattern of fire returned and he counted breaths like a man keeping watch. The title men later gave the episode, calling it a coward's move in a headline meant to provoke, missed the moral of the act. Cowardice implies a refusal to stand when needed. Jesse chose to expose himself in order that others might live. If anything, the burliness of his decision reframed cowardice as something one could weaponize, the pretense of self-preservation that becomes a tool for survival. He used what others might call fear as a lens, focusing it until it did a useful job. In that reframing, an ordinary man bent the shape of a fight. On the anniversary of Buana, veterans gathered near a weathered tank at a base that had been converted into a museum. Men with hair gone to white and backs stiff from years of work leaned their hands on railings and remembered. Some did not speak. Others recited the sequence of the assault as if it were a hymn, not for its sanctity, but for its facts. They told of a private who pointed while the world burned, and of a brother who never came home. They told the story because stories are how communities make sense of chaotic cruelty. The larger victory history assigned to Buana, the tactical gain that loosened a stubborn line, was not the product of a single action in isolation. It was the sum of planning and chance, of supply and sickness, of men who followed orders, and of a private who refused to let his regiment be blind. Jesse's choice did not make the war end. It made specific lives continue. In that ledger, the tangible consequence was the thing that mattered. Men who would go home to wives and to children and to fields where their hands would learn a gentler rhythm. The medals and the manuals followed. The grief did not.
At dusk, when the museum's lights turned the tank into a silhouette, a small plaque told the story with the usual words: courage, selflessness, recognition. It could not inscribe the smell of napalm into a word, nor the feel of a brother's name folded into a pocket. Those remained private facts. But the doctrine that later required a spotter, the small change that kept crews from becoming coffins of flame, passed into training and saved others. That was, in the slow and unromantic arithmetic of war, the part that mattered most. Jesse grew old in a house that smelled of sawdust and the roast of Sunday dinners. He visited the museum once, standing a respectful distance from the tank. Children pointed.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Act full distance from the tank". Children pointed. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Contexto. He would not claim the tale. He would only correct a detail now and then, the way a man adjusts a story to make it truer. He kept in a drawer the telegram with his brother's name. He kept, hanging beside it, the ribbon that did not and could not make whole what had been broken. He learned, as all survivors do, to live beside the absence and to measure his days by what he could fix with his hands, and by the quiet pride that men still lived because he had chosen to be seen. The hornet's nest had been a tangle of wood and concrete and men who would have been buried if light had not found a way. Jesse's move, improvised, simple, and at the time unorthodox, unlocked a sequence that changed the immediate fight and nudged institutional practice. The victory the historians called great was made of many parts, but one of those parts had the shape of a man on a hull, pointing into the morning, and, by doing so, deciding that some lives mattered enough to risk his own. He never demanded the language of hero. He refused to let a medal be the final argument. His story was, as so many are, about messy, small choices that ripple outward. The army would write manuals, and the museums would place tanks under light, but the stubborn human fact remained. Someone, somewhere, chose to be seen. And because he chose that, others saw. He kept his hands busy because idleness made memory louder. The bench in the shed had a permanent imprint where his knees had rested. Planes and chisels lay in their grooves as if waiting for him to return. On Sundays, he would rise early, light a pot of coffee, and stand at the kitchen window while the light found the oak trees in the yard. The house smelled the way it always had, sawdust and the roast, a history of small fires and steady heat. Sometimes a smell, rubbed leather, motor oil, the dry tang of gunpowder, arrived like a guest he did not summon, and stayed until he opened a drawer and touched the ribbon, smoothing the crease with a finger that moved more slowly than memory. Visitors who came because the museum's lights had turned his deed into a bullet point rarely stayed long in the kitchen. They sat at the small table and asked the arranged questions. What were you thinking? Did you expect to live through it? Do you consider yourself a hero? Jesse answered as he had learned to answer, with care and with the economy of a man who had been taught to measure speech. I did what saved men, he would say finally, and then let silence do the rest. What he meant, what he had always meant, didn't fit neatly into the categories they offered. Courage and cowardice sat on the same shelf with grief and habit. He had carried them like tools, choosing whichever handled a particular problem best.
Sometimes that meant pointing into the morning until a man elsewhere found a place to stand. Sometimes it meant returning home and learning to be present in the small domestic economies of food and wood, and the steady ritual of listening to his son tell the same joke he had heard 30 years before. Tom visited when he could. He came with his own thin, practical ways of showing care, mending a leaky gutter, fixing a stubborn hinge, and with an impatience that belonged to men who had learned to carry obligations in time-sliced increments. He asked his father about the hornet's nest with the cautious curiosity of someone who loved a man that history sought to flatten into a single image. Sometimes Tom's questions were careful, sometimes they were blunt. He worried, as sons do, about the stories that land on a father's shoulders and make him smaller. "You ought to tell them how it was," Tom said once, after they had eaten and the sun had gone low enough to cut the kitchen into long rectangles. "Not the headlines, the parts that matter." Jesse wiped his hands with the tail of a dishcloth and looked at him. "I tell them when they ask," he said. "The rest they'll learn on their own." "It's not just about you," Tom persisted. "It's about what comes after. If people think fear is shameful, they'll hide it. Might save a few from a kind of dying." Jesse folded himself into the chair and watched the light cross the table. "Fear's a tool, Tom. You can let it own you, or you can use it. I chose to use it." Tom exhaled. "You were always good at making the world make sense." The truth was more complicated and softer and worse. Jesse had never been precise enough to know what it meant to make the world make sense. He had only been stubborn enough to keep doing small things until something altered. He had watched younger men afterward repeating the movement he once made until it became doctrine, until someone in training wrote it down in a manual, until instructors beat the rhythm into recruits' heads with the blunt authority of survival. Those repetitions were the most honest tribute he could imagine. Men saving other men because a gesture once proved useful. He took comfort in that kind of immortality, one that did not require speeches, only repeated utility. A few veterans wrote to him over the years, brief postcards smudged with considerable handwriting. A typed letter from a man in Ohio who said simply that his son had come home because someone used the sightlines Jesse had shown. A photograph of a reunion, grim faces, too many hands clasped, left a stamp on the mantel. He pinned them up near the workbench like a sparse shrine, not for praise, but for proof. Proof that the ledger of choices had entries beyond the medal and the plaque. One autumn, a young soldier appeared at the door without warning. He introduced himself as Malik, and his hair was still short in the way of men newly returned to civilian life.
He had traveled because someone at the museum had said Jesse liked visitors who asked sensible questions. Malik folded his hands and stayed on the porch for a long time before coming in, as if he measured permission. "You don't have to speak if you," he began, and then stopped because Jesse was already pouring coffee and setting a cup in front of him. Malik's hands trembled when he took the cup. "I read what they wrote," he said finally, voice quieter than the kitchen clock. "But I wanted to hear it from someone who remembers the thing that wasn't in the paper." They sat at the table, and Jesse listened. Malik had been in Afghanistan after the doctrine changed. His unit used the spotter-first technique they taught in training. One morning their convoy hung in the kind of silence that smells like waiting. A lighthouse on the ridge, rock, not tank, became everything. Malik described the way his sergeant had moved when an incendiary rocket came down the road, how the sergeant had used the same pattern of exposure and withdrawal that had once been improvised at Buna. The sergeant had died later from complications no one could have foreseen. But that morning, Malik's life and the lives of 3 other men were saved. "So, when I saw your name on that plaque," Malik said, he swallowed, "I wanted to thank you." Jesse folded his fingers around his cup. He felt gratitude then in a shape he recognized but had rarely encountered, external, returned. It did not heal the old absence, nor did it file it into neat categories. It rested right beside the telegram in the drawer, a small papered thing that refused to change its own meaning. "Did your sergeant talk about fear?" Jesse asked. Malik smiled a little, embarrassed. "Not like you did," he said. "We don't talk about fear. We talk about being ready." "Do you think being ready is different from being afraid?" Jesse asked, quiet as the clock. "Yes," Malik said at once. "Being ready is choosing to act even when you're afraid. That's," he stopped, groping for the words, "that's what he did and what you did." They did not talk about medals. They did not talk about headlines. Malik lingered like the kind of visitor who left with a small, honest alteration in the way he walked down the street, as if the conversation had lightened one pocket. Jesse watched him go and saw for the first time in a long time how the gesture he had made kept going like a current under water, unseen but felt. There were other currents. Each year, a small parade visited the museum on Buna's anniversary. Civilian officials with neat speeches, a band that played a tune that tugged at throats, flags that snapped in wind. Jesse attended once or twice and then stopped going, because the official language felt brittle against the real weight of what the war had left behind. Instead, he would walk, unannounced, to the cemetery where his brother lay under a stone the size of a modest grief.
"He lay under a stone the size of a modest grief." He would say his piece, short sentences, not theatrical, and then stand with his hand on the cold stone until the cold meant something to hold. "You keep it in the drawer," Tom said once, raising his chin at the workshop where the telegram lay in its corner. "You ought to give it to someone some day." Jesse thought of paper and of bodies leaving hollows. "It's not for me to give," he said. "It's for whoever needs to remember." Tom did not press. Sons often know when to let fathers keep their private relics. At night, Jesse sometimes dreamed the assault in a sequence of small motions rather than as a single monstrous tableau. He dreamed of pulling a strap tight, of rotating a hatch, of watching the light break a slat of wood, and then the way the slat would glow for a second like an ember. The dreams were less about glory and more about the handwork of living, precise, repetitive, necessary. Waking, he walked through the house and checked cupboards, the way some men count breaths. There were days when joy arrived, a child's laughter from across the yard, the crisp bite of a new notch on the lathe, and he accepted it with the guarded hunger of someone who knows delight will have to share space with memory. In the evenings, neighbors drifted by with small matters, boards to be measured, a fence post that needed setting, a story about the bakery down the road. Conversation in that town had a slow buoyancy to it, the kind that keeps people close enough to notice when one of them stops coming to market. They brought with them fragments of the larger world, a mention of a new training video, a college scholarship for a veteran's child, a headline about a foreign conflict that felt both remote and intimate. Jessie listened, dispensed advice, and then returned to tasks that repaired the house or the world in small increments. Every so often, a new detail arrived to complicate the account museum curators had set in bronze. Once a local reporter sought out the veteran who had corrected details when the museum plaque misnamed the hill where the hornet's nest had been. Another time, a young instructor asked for permission to quote Jessie in a manual revision. He allowed his words to be used when they were useful, and declined when they were not. He had no taste for being a monument speechwriter. He preferred to let the work, training evolutions, small household habits, carry the meaning forward. The grandchildren began to come, as if by a tide. It turned slow and inevitable. They ran with the careless energy of children, unaware of the ledger of choices that shaped the tiles of the world they had inherited. Jessie taught them to sand the corners of a chair until their palms hurt pleasantly. He showed them how to plane a board so the grain looked like a river running steady. When one of them pointed, once, twice, heedless of all the past meanings contained in a pointing finger, Jessie watched, amused and not surprised. Pointing was a simple act. It directed attention.
Sometimes attention is all a person can offer to another, and at other times it becomes the beginning of something that outlives speech. On an afternoon when the light made the shed glow like a honeyed room, Jessie sat on his bench and wrote a short letter to the museum curator. He corrected a single factual detail about the orientation of the tank and requested a modest amendment to the plaque's wording. He asked that the record acknowledge not only the act, but the recipe by which it had come to matter. Improvisation, fear used as guidance, the names of the men who had taught and shown and later trained others in the technique. He did not ask for the language of heroism to be removed. He simply wanted accuracy. Accuracy, he believed, was a form of respect. Tom folded the letter and slid it into an envelope for him. "It'll take more than a plaque to make the story honest," Tom said. "No," Jessie agreed, "but it's a start." The evening came slow and forgiving. He sat on the porch with a mug gone cold and listened to the sound of a child down the block playing a flute, a thin, tentative sound that made him smile because it was human and therefore unstoppable. He thought about the sequence of small acts that make a person, the sharpening of a tool, the decision to stand in the light for a moment, the choice to speak when asked. He had been a man who practiced those small acts until they learned to reorder the world. That was his claim, modest and precise. When the sun finally dropped and the first stars appeared, a little figure ran up the path, his grandson, breath hot and cheerful. He flung himself against Jessie's knees and looked up with an impatience that demanded stories. "Tell me again about the big tank," the boy said, eyes bright. Jessie set his mug down and laughed softly. "Which part do you want?" he asked. "The part where the metal was cold? Or the part where the men were brave? Or the part where someone pointed and taught others how to see?" The boy thought, brow furrowing in the comical seriousness of someone weighing a choice. "All of it," he said. Jessie looked at his hands and then at the night that was settling like a blanket over everything they had built. The house smelled of sawdust and roast and the quiet of days kept.
He gathered the boy onto his lap and began to speak, not as a monument, but as a man telling a child the work of the world. How light reveals where danger lies, how pointing sometimes saves, and how people keep living in the narrow spaces between loss and repair. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees and carried a small scattering of leaves across the yard. The boy's fingers, small and earnest, curled tight around Jesse's hand. In the next yard over, someone else, someone who would never know the names carved in museums, trained a dog to sit. A bicycle bell rang. The town breathed its habitual, ordinary rhythm. A camera, positioned on a tripod near the back, blinked red and then was forgotten. People drifted in. Women who had known Jesse's name as a sound more than a story. Boys who had been shown how to carry planks without letting their shoulders take the weight. Old men who remembered nights when the town was less safe and therefore promised louder at the dinner table. At the front, the mayor gave a speech that moved through the usual timbers of public speech. Valor, community, gratitude. It was warm and not entirely dishonest. When he reached for the phrase that would make the moment tidy, heroes among us, brave and selfless, Jesse felt no anger at the words themselves. He felt only the small tautness of a man who holds a seam tight because he knows what will fray if the pressure is released. Tom spoke next. He had read Jesse's letter once before, when the house was quiet, and he had something like reverence in his face as he stepped to the microphone. He did not deliver the letter as a sermon. He delivered it as a set of instructions. This is a record, Tom said, not of glory, but of method, of who did what as they did it and why their choices mattered. He turned the paper so the morning light caught the edges. The crowd leaned forward with a curious civil hush. Jesse felt his mouth go dry. He had not planned to speak. He had planned only to listen and, afterward, to go home and let the world keep whatever story it preferred. But when Tom asked, without flourish, whether Jesse would say a few words, the request arrived not like a demand, but like trust. The small child who had run up Jesse's path the night before sat now on the curb with his legs crossed, looking up as if his grandfather were a kind of tall animal that might perform a trick. So Jesse went to the microphone. He told them then, in the thin, clear way he had taught boys to file metal, the small truths he had begged the record to keep. How light mattered. How fear could be an instrument if handled without panic. How pointing at danger and naming it was sometimes the only way to move a crowd without trampling its members. He spoke of names, of men who had stood in doorways and held the line, of those who had taught others what to do and how to be steady under pressure. He did not mince the fact that there had been mistakes, that there had been fear used badly. He did not elevate every action into virtue. He spoke with the modest precision of someone who believed usefulness, not heroism, deserved the last word. When he finished, there was a silence like a held breath. Then the mayor cleared his throat, and, with a civility that seemed almost new, he invited the plaque to be unveiled. 2 young men pulled the cloth away. The bronze had been worked by a local artisan. The letters were not gilded, but cleanly cut, the list of names balanced beneath a short paragraph that Tom had insisted on including. It read less like eulogy and more like ledger. Dates, names, actions. Underneath, Jesse's words were printed in a small, plain type. The recipe for how the work had been done, the sequence of small choices that made the larger thing possible. There were looks. Some of them were puzzled, some relieved, some faintly irritated, because it is a rare thing for a town to accept a history that will not canonize it. A woman who had once been a volunteer nurse came forward and brushed her fingers against the letters as if to test whether they belonged to her hands now. The boy on the curb reached up and traced the name of a man he had never met. He looked at Jessie, and his eyes were steady and bright in the way that surprised a man who had not expected so large a thing to come from a small child. Later, when people dispersed into the shade of maples and the clatter of coffee cups resumed, Jessie walked alone for a short time through streets that seemed both new and familiar. He understood now what he had been keeping safe in his drawer of small things. Not a secret exactly, but a set of tools aligned with an ethic. He had feared, without drama, that this ethic might be turned into a myth. The plaque, with its blunt, tidy honesty, felt like a compromise between a myth and the unadorned truth. It would never fill bookstore shelves. It would, perhaps, prevent some bright exaggeration. On his porch he found his grandson waiting, as if he had known the right point to return. The boy climbed into Jessie's lap and, without asking first, opened his hand and showed him a small brass washer. Tom said this was from the plaque shed, he said. I wanted to keep something that was part of it. Jessie laughed and took the washer and set it on his thumb. It was smooth, its edges worn in the way that made small objects feel like history. Keep it, he said, and the words had no ceremony. Learn how it fits, learn how to file away the rough, and how to know when something is strong enough. How do you teach that? The boy asked, earnest as ever. He had the earnestness of those who think particulars are the best way to hold a big idea. You start by showing, Jessie said. He stood, the stiffness of age momentarily forgotten, and led the boy to his bench. He brought out a block of wood and a small hand plane, and set the boy's fingers on the tool, the way a father finds his son's hands to place them where a hinge will be set. They worked that afternoon in a light that moved across the bench in thin bands. Jessie spoke of things that sounded small. How to listen to the sound a tool makes when it cuts clean. How to feel for the grain in a board as one feels for another person's tone. He told the boy the names of men who had taught him, not mythic titles, but names with the wobble of human vowels. The boy repeated them, slowly, like someone pronouncing a handful of small stones.
When the light slanted late and the lamp on the porch made the wood come warm orange, Jessie told the boy again the piece of the letter that mattered most. Not the list of acts, not even the list of names, but the insistence that the work be done well, because lives would rest on it. It's not about being brave for the story, he said. It's about being careful so the next person can go home. The boy's hand came up and closed around Jessie's. I'll learn, he said simply. That night, Jessie slept with a sense of small completion. There had been no grand resolution, no sudden applause that rewrote history, but there had been a settling of accounts in modest, practical ways. The record had been nudged toward honesty. A boy had a washer in his pocket. The recipe of the act, so dear to Jessie, had been printed in bronze where hands could touch it, and where the words would remain plainly available to those who wanted to understand what had actually happened. In the days that followed, people came to the plaque to read and to remember, and sometimes to argue quietly with the language. A former soldier stopped by one morning and left a strip of cloth tucked beneath the bronze, the gesture more personal than any speech. A woman who taught in the school read the names aloud to her class and asked the children to write what they thought the recipe meant. Tom visited more often than anyone expected.
He would bring small coffins of parts, bolts, shims, a scrap of leather, and place them on Jesse's porch like offerings that made sense only when explained. Work continued. The town kept its ordinary rhythms. Men and women still sharpened their tools and made the small decisions that shape any day. Sometimes the language of heroism returned, like a tide that brings shells and leaves on shore. Sometimes accuracy returned as well, and those who cared to look found beneath the polished phrases the sequence of choices that made help possible. On an autumn evening, when the air had the precise coldness that announces the year's slow wrap, Jesse sat again on his porch with his grandson beside him. The boy hummed a tune, a thin, hopeful sound like a flute across a fence. A bicycle bell rang. A dog barked twice in the distance and then stopped. A light flashed on a puddle, and the two of them watched the small, bright circle move and break. "Will you teach me the others?" the boy asked at last. Jesse looked at his hands, the palms stained with oil, and the little scar near his thumb, and felt the ledger inside him, the tally of choices and people. He thought of the plaque, of the list of names, of Tom folding the letter, and of men who had shown others how to see. "I will," he said, "and you will teach the next one after that. That's how the work keeps doing what it's supposed to do." The boy nodded solemnly, as he had nodded at other small oaths.